Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People of Reddit who have practiced or witnessed acts of the witchcraft, voodoo, or the occult. What was the strangest, most unexplainable thing you saw? Story 1. Dating app horror story.
A few years ago, I found myself navigating the vast world of online dating. Like many people, I thought it was a convenient way to meet new faces, and the prospect of chatting with someone who shared my interests seemed exciting. Little did I know, one particular match would leave me questioning reality itself. It started innocently enough. I matched with an attractive person who had an intriguing profile. Their photos were quirky but appealing, with one standing out, a close-up of them holding a rabbit mask. The mask was unsettling, to say the least. It was white with streaks of what looked like dried blood smeared across its surface. Despite the creepiness of that detail, I decided to start a conversation. Our chat began with the usual small talk, hobbies, favorite movies, music, and the like. They seemed charming, though there was an odd edge to their humor, as if they thrived on unsettling remarks. When the conversation shifted to plans for the evening, I asked casually, "What are you up to tonight?" Their reply stopped me in my tracks. "Oh, I'm going to play hide and seek with Fluffy," they said, accompanied by a grinning emoji. I was confused, so I pressed further. "Fluffy?" I asked, thinking it might be a pet or an inside joke. "Fluffy," they replied, the rabbit mask from my second picture. The mention of the mask made my stomach twist a little, but I decided to play along. "Where are you planning to play?" I asked, forcing a light-hearted tone. Their response chilled me. "In your basement." At first I dismissed it as a wild guess or a poor attempt at humor. After all, they could not possibly know if I even had a basement. Trying to keep the conversation on track, I lied. "I do not have a basement," I typed. The next message came almost immediately. "Oh, really?" Before I could respond, I heard it. A sound that can only be described as an eerie, distorted screech boomed from below my feet. It was so loud and out of place that I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound had come from the basement. Adrenaline surged through me. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what was happening. I had no wireless internet, no smart devices, and certainly no speakers that could have been hacked. My basement was completely enclosed, accessible only from within the house. Yet here I was, staring at my phone in shock, trying to make sense of the impossible. Panic set in, and I immediately blocked the person on the dating app. My hands were trembling as I stared at the chat, their unsettling messages still fresh on my screen. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, unable to gather the courage to move. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and grab the nearest heavy object for protection, a sturdy flashlight, before heading cautiously to the basement door. The house was unnervingly silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my mind conjuring every possible scenario of what could be waiting for me below. Finally, with a deep breath, I turned the knob and opened the door. The basement stairs stretched down into darkness. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, my flashlight beam cut through the shadows as I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made me uneasy. When I reached the bottom, the basement was as empty as I had left it. The bare concrete floor and exposed beams looked undisturbed. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of anyone, no trace of the source of the sound. The oppressive silence was only broken by the faint hum of the water heater. Relief began to creep in, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion. What had caused that sound? And how had my online match seemingly known about my basement? The coincidences were too strange to ignore. I lingered for a moment longer, then decided to go back upstairs and lock the door behind me. The rest of the night passed in a haze of anxiety. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. Morning brought no answers, and the events of the previous night weighed heavily on my mind. Over the next few days I avoided the basement entirely, unwilling to confront the lingering unease it held. Weeks went by without incident, and I began to convince myself that it had been an elaborate prank, though I could not explain how it had been executed. Still, the experience left a scar, and I became much more cautious in my online interactions. To this day, I cannot fully explain what happened. Was it a twisted coincidence, a paranormal encounter, or something else entirely? I will never know. One thing is certain, I have never returned to that dating app, and I never will.
Story 2. The Pendant's Secret.
When I was in high school, a strange series of events turned my life into a waking nightmare. I was not going through any stressful times, and I have never been easily frightened. Having grown up on 1980s and 1990s horror films, I slept soundly in complete darkness with the door shut. However, out of nowhere, I began to experience horrifying nightmares and relentless episodes of sleep paralysis. Night after night, I would wake to an overwhelming sense of terror. In one instance, I saw my room engulfed in flames. On another occasion, bats swarmed the air above me, their wings thrashing wildly. The worst, however, was the figure, an ominous silhouette hovering inches above my body. I could not move, I could not breathe, and I could not escape. Sometimes, even when my speakers were completely turned off, they emitted strange, high-pitched frequencies that sent shivers down my spine. Objects would inexplicably fall from shelves, as though unseen hands were at play. The fear became unbearable. Most nights I would retreat to the couch in the living room, seeking the faint comfort of the television's glow. My mother would always find me there in the morning, exhausted and desperate for peace. Then, just as suddenly as the terror began, it stopped. When I mentioned this to my mother, she hesitated before revealing the truth. She had sought the help of a priestess who had engraved a protective blessing on a silver pendant. The priestess instructed her to discreetly place the pendant in my room without my knowledge, to ensure its effectiveness. My mother never told me, wanting to see if the protection would work. Since that day, I have not experienced a single episode of sleep paralysis or those haunting nightmares. The pendant remains in my room, a silent guardian against the unknown.
Story 3. Circle Beneath the Floor.
I used to work in an occult bookstore, a place that seemed to breathe with the weight of ages. The shop wasn't much to look at on the outside, a nondescript building tucked away in a corner of the city. But inside it felt different, like the air was thick with something older than time itself. The front of the store was filled with the typical things you'd expect: tarot cards, crystals, incense, and books that promised to unlock the mysteries of the universe. But in the back, behind a heavy wooden door, was a glass case filled with rarer, far more expensive items. That's where the real magic was stored. The owner, a very old man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that seemed to have seen everything, was the keeper of those treasures. There was one woman who used to visit the store regularly. She was hard to miss, always talking, never stopping. Her words poured out like an unstoppable torrent, covering everything from the absurd to the fantastical. She would speak of secret knowledge she claimed to possess, of hidden truths she alone could see. The shop's air would grow heavy with her presence. She had the kind of personality that drained you, like a vacuum sucking all the energy from the room. She was what some might call an energy vampire. The moment she left, the room felt emptier, like a piece of you had gone with her. One afternoon, the old man and I were both in the shop when she walked in. As usual, she immediately began her endless monologue. This time, though, something strange happened. Within a minute of speaking, she faltered. Her words started to stumble, her eyes glazed over, and she seemed tired. She hummed for a moment, looked around as though unsure of where she was, and then, without a word, turned and left. It was unlike any interaction I had seen with her before. Normally, she would drain every ounce of your patience, but today she was utterly subdued. Curious, I approached the owner as he returned to his work. "What happened? She usually stays for hours," I asked. He smiled softly, a glint of something ancient in his eyes. "There's a circle of protection painted under the floor for a reason," he said, his voice low and steady. It was only then that I realized there were strange symbols hidden beneath the floorboards, faintly visible only if you knew where to look. The circle wasn't just for show, it was a barrier, an ancient safeguard against something far darker than anything we could understand. After that day, the woman never returned. Whether she knew what had happened or simply never dared to come back, I couldn't say. But sometimes, when I walked through the store late at night, I could still feel the faint pressure of something pressing against the edges of the protection, something hungry.
Story 4. Haunted Room.
When my sister was about 13, she developed an intense interest in the occult, Wicca, witchcraft, all of it. She wasn't quite sure what she was getting into, but that didn't stop her from embracing it with all her heart. Almost immediately after she began exploring this world, strange things started to happen in our house. It started with fleeting glimpses of things moving out of the corner of our eyes, and soon escalated to objects shifting around in front of us. It wasn't just odd, it was unsettling. We could always find a way to rationalize it though. The house was old. Maybe the drafts caused the doors to creak open. The land had a history, and perhaps that was why it felt so strange. But when we moved across the country, and even across continents, the weirdness followed us. My mom and sister left early to find a new home, while my dad, brother and I stayed behind to pack up the old house. It was during this time that things took a more sinister turn. Every night from my sister's old room we could hear heavy thumping sounds like something large was moving around. The doors and windows would open and close on their own, even when the air was still. Shadows would dart underneath the door, no matter how tightly the blinds were shut. None of us could explain it. I'm not sensitive to these things, but it was obvious to everyone that something was wrong. The disturbances grew more aggressive when we began cleaning, as if whatever it was, it didn't want the place to be disturbed. Every time we tried to tidy up or organize, the noises grew louder. When we finally moved to the new house, we hoped that it was over. But the same things happened again. The disturbances centered around my sister's room. Windows rattled, lights flickered, and we could hear footsteps when no one was there. But it wasn't until she finally left that everything stopped. The second we cleaned out her room in our new home, the strange occurrences ceased. Whatever it was, it had been tied to her, her presence, her room, and the disorder she left behind. Only then did the house feel still, the air lighter. But I will never forget that feeling. The fear that whatever it was followed us, bound to her in ways we would never understand.
Story 5. Magic that haunts my family.
I've always known my family had a little magic. We've experienced things, unexplainable things that run through generations. It started when I was staying with my grandmother. I had a terrible toothache and was up late trying to stay quiet so I wouldn't disturb anyone. My 2-year-old daughter called for me, and when I bent over her crib, she placed her tiny hand on my cheek and said, "Poor mama." In that instant, the pain was gone. Just like that, vanished. Another time, I was helping my cousin move into his first apartment. When I pulled into the parking lot, my daughter looked up from her dolls and said, "Monsters live there." She spent the day talking to her friends from behind the curtains. I never told my cousin about the monsters, but he moved out after just 20 days. When I was 20, I had a vivid dream. I was talking to a little girl who said, "We have to save him." "Who?" I asked. She pointed over the side of a raft to black, oily water where a baby boy floated. I pulled him into my arms, and the girl smiled, telling me, "I'm glad we picked you." 3 years later, I had a daughter and a newborn son. Both of them looked exactly like the children in my dream. But the most terrifying experience happened when I was 13. My future sister-in-law stayed over, and we were up late. The corners of my room began to darken, creeping in closer until it felt suffocating. Terrified, we fled downstairs, only to see a large rotten fox walking on its hind legs outside the window. It stared at us for what felt like an eternity before it disappeared. There was also the night my baby brother wouldn't stop crying. My mum finally settled him at 3 a.m., but as she lay in bed, she heard the sound of a walker coming down the hall. She knew all the children were upstairs. Then the bedroom door opened, and a strong hand gripped her wrist, pulling her out of bed. She couldn't speak, couldn't wake my father. With all her strength, she yanked her wrist free and turned to face the door. The walker was empty, but it stood there, its cold presence filling the room. A handprint-like bruise was burned into her skin. I don't know what's behind these events, but it feels like something ancient, tied to my family, something that watches and waits.
Story 6. Consequences of Dark Magic.
My mother and I both practice witchcraft, though in different forms. I consider myself a white witch, focusing on healing and positive energy, while my mother practices a darker form of magic, often involving hexes, curses, and other forms of retribution. Over the years, my mother has cast several hexes on people who have wronged her or her family. She is unafraid of the consequences of karma, or the rule of 3, which is the belief that what you put out into the universe will return to you threefold. One particular incident that stands out in my memory happened when I was a child. There was a man who worked with my stepfather, and this man was constantly trying to sabotage my stepfather's career. He would steal clients, take credit for my stepfather's work, and actively try to ruin his reputation. My mother became fed up with his behavior. In response, she cast a hex on him. Within days, his life began to fall apart. He lost clients, his deals started to fall through, and he even began to lose his hair from the stress. His family went through severe economic hardship, and his life took a complete 180. To this day, he has not fully recovered and continues to struggle in both his career and personal life. There was another time when an old friend of mine betrayed me, and it affected me deeply. She turned others against me, causing me to fall into a period of depression. My mother saw how hurt I was and decided to perform a hex in response. I did not know about this at the time, but months later, my mother revealed that she had cursed both my friend and her family. Within days of the hex, everything seemed to go wrong for them. Her family fell into financial difficulties. They lost their car and nearly lost their home. Her father, who had no prior health issues, suffered a stroke and was bedridden for several days, unable to work. Her schoolwork also suffered. It was a tough time for them, and my mother never told me what she had done until months later. When I learned of it, I was terrified by the consequences of her actions. Magic, particularly hexes, is not something to be taken lightly. I would never engage in such practices myself, but my mother continues to wield this kind of magic without hesitation. Sometimes I worry about the cost of such power and what might happen when karma decides to take its toll.
Story 7. Witchcraft Strikes.
Before I went to Africa, I had always heard rumors about witchcraft and lightning, but I never took them seriously. I thought it was just superstition or exaggeration. That was until I experienced something that turned me into a full believer. I was doing humanitarian work in a township, basically large subdivisions filled with small cinder block houses. It was a rough place, but the people were kind and the work was rewarding. However, there was a dark undercurrent running through the area, and some of the locals would speak in hushed tones about witchcraft. I never believed in any of it. That was until one day when everything changed. It was a clear afternoon, with no cloud in the sky. The air was still, and the sun hung high above us. I was walking through the township, helping with some community efforts, when suddenly I heard a loud crack, a thunderous noise that made the ground vibrate beneath me. Without warning, a massive red bolt of lightning shot from the sky and struck a shack in the distance. The shack exploded in a burst of flames, and I could feel the heat even from where I stood. But the strangest part was that there wasn't a cloud in the sky. No thunderstorm, no rain, just a perfect clear day. I froze, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The people around me weren't shocked. Instead, they began whispering to one another, their faces grim. "Witchcraft," one of them muttered under his breath. "Witchcraft did that." At that moment, a chill crawled up my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was some freak atmospheric phenomenon, or maybe there had been some hidden storm cloud, but no explanation made sense. The feeling of dread only deepened as I realized that the people of the township were not surprised, as if they had seen this kind of thing before. Over the next few weeks, I saw more strange occurrences, unexplained illnesses, sudden disappearances, and strange rituals being performed at night, but nothing ever compared to that lightning strike. That event left me shaken, and I began to believe in the dark powers that some people wield. No matter how hard I try to explain it away, I know what I saw, and I know what the people of the township believed. Witchcraft, it seems, is real, and it can strike without warning, without explanation, and with terrifying force.
Story 8. Worshipping Satan.
I'm not religious. In fact, I've always considered myself a logical person, someone who believes in doing good but with no real faith in any higher power, especially not in the idea of evil spirits. That's why what happened to me still messes with my mind. Even now, years later, it's something I can't fully explain. The experience still freaks me out, and I've only ever told my brother about it. When I was in high school, I dated a guy who, to be blunt, was always a jerk. But towards the end of our relationship, he started talking about worshipping Satan. I thought he was just going through some weird phase. One night, while we were on the phone, this was before cell phones, so we were on a landline, he told me that he had sent something to visit me that night. Naturally, I laughed it off. I didn't take him seriously at all. After we hung up, I fell asleep, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I felt the worst stomach cramps I've ever experienced. It was so bad that I couldn't get comfortable. I tossed and turned, trying to go back to sleep, but it wouldn't go away unless I sat up and opened my eyes. I finally managed to calm myself down, thinking it was just some random stomachache. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It sounded like a man's voice right in my ear. "Hey." I jerked awake, looked around the room. Nothing. I brushed it off and closed my eyes again, trying to get back to sleep. But then, the cramping started again, more intense this time. And then, another whisper, right in my ear. "Wake up." At this point, I was fully freaked out. The cramps stopped the moment I sat up, but my heart was racing. The whispers were so close. It felt like someone was hovering over me just inches from my ear, speaking in a low, chilling voice. I pulled the covers over my head, hoping to hide from whatever was happening. I tried to stay still, pretending it wasn't real, but that wasn't the end of it. Then I started hearing tapping noises. It was like someone was walking through my room, smacking things randomly. I couldn't explain where the sounds were coming from, and they were so clear, so real. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of my bed, ripped my bedroom door open, and ran out of the room as fast as I could. That night changed me. To this day, I can't explain what happened, and it's one of those things that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world. Whatever it was that night, whatever I felt, heard, and experienced, I still don't have an explanation for it. But I know one thing for sure. Something was in that room with me, and it wasn't human.
Story 9. Price of disrespect.
For 5 or 6 years, I was deeply involved in our local Santeria community, a practice that's often seen as the Cuban cousin of Voodoo. There are many things I saw during that time that seemed more than coincidental, things that still stay with me today. I'll try to share this story without delving too deeply into the specifics of tradition, but if anyone has questions about the details or the authenticity of what happened, feel free to reach out. There was a young man who had joined our community, and at first he played the part of a quirky troublemaker, a lost soul. Someone who always seemed to be in and out of trouble but never really hurting anyone. That was until he crossed a serious line. He stole a car and a large sum of money from one of the highest-ranking priests in the community. After that, he vanished. No one saw him again for a while. Months later, we learned he'd made his way to another city and had requested to be initiated into the priesthood at a different isle, a church or temple. Becoming a priest in Santeria is no small task. It's an expensive and lengthy process, often costing tens of thousands of dollars. The initiation involves a week of intense rituals, ceremonies, and feasts. But at the end of it all, the most important part of the ceremony is the divination, the reading of one's fate and life path, guided by the spirits and the gods. It's considered the blueprint for your life going forward. So this guy went through it all, the money, the time, the work. He spent an entire week preparing for the divination, surrounded by other priests and people who had taken time off from their lives to make this happen for him. The moment came. The elder priest who would be conducting the divination looked at him and began the reading. After a few moments of silence, the elder turned to him and said the words that would change everything. "The gods don't want you. Get up and leave." It was cold. The words hung in the air like ice. He was told to leave. The gods had rejected him. No explanation, no second chance. And after that, no one in the community has seen him since. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. Some say he disappeared completely. Some say he was driven out by the rejection, but the truth is no one has ever heard from him again. It's as if the gods themselves decided he wasn't worthy and erased him from our lives as though he never existed at all.
Story 10. Ouija board entity.
When I was a kid, my friends and I were obsessed with anything creepy, ghosts, the paranormal, and the occult. I identified as a witch, and we would often sneak around to local haunted spots trying to summon spirits. Our favorite activity was using Ouija boards, and that's where this terrifying story begins. One day my friend came to me, looking pale and shaken. He had used a homemade Ouija board on the school bus and contacted a ghost that called itself A. The ghost warned him of something sinister, but we didn't know what. Curious, we decided to conduct a proper session at my house. I had just received a real Ouija board for Christmas, and we were ready for whatever came next. We set up a circle of salt, lit candles, and used lavender as a substitute for sage. We began the session, but things went wrong almost immediately. The The board answered with cryptic messages. We asked for its name and it said T. We asked what it was and it replied, proxy. A quick search online revealed that proxy meant it was an agent for something darker. Then we heard a loud noise coming from the closet. My friends rushed to check, but I stayed behind, keeping my fingers on the planchette to avoid ending the session prematurely. They screamed and ran out of the room. They told me they had seen a long, black, shadowy figure with tiny white eyes curled up in a fetal position on the closet floor. We immediately ended the session, but when we returned with holy water, something even more disturbing happened. The planchette, which we had removed, was back on the board by itself. All our items were scattered around it. We quickly blessed the board and tried talking to the spirits again. Chu revealed its dark intentions, saying it wanted to drain my friends of their essence and was connected to their families. I claimed it was there to protect them. After several more sightings of the shadowy figure, most often outside our windows, we realized we had opened a door to something evil. Eventually, we had the house smudged and the hauntings stopped. To this day, I'm a Wiccan, and I've promised myself I will never use a Ouija board again.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.